I now recognize the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, for the purpose of offering her amendment. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In this report, it does seem, well, first I want to acknowledge that after a long history of various individuals in the body denying the existence of climate change, I do want to say that it's very encouraging to see that there is some acknowledgement of the climate crisis here in the report. But when we look closer, it does seem that it's only mentioned about twice, once to criticize climate science at the U.S. Geological Survey, and once in a section offering scientifically dubious solutions. But in the report, there is a failure to acknowledge the disproportionate impact that these changes have on communities of color and other frontline communities, many of whom are all of our constituents. So I'm proposing an amendment that would require the collection of public health data and other impacts of new drilling on federal lands. My colleagues say that opening more of our federal lands to fossil fuel development is what their constituents want and need. I'm not here to dispute that point in this moment. But I will say that surely, if that is the case, then there should be no objection to gathering better data on the health impact of these policies on the health and safety of everyday Americans. So I truly believe this is a common sense amendment that would help protect and inform the American people, especially the most vulnerable among us. And I urge my colleagues to support the amendment, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Would anybody else like to be recognized to speak on the amendment? Mr. Rosendale, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, how can you ignore that emissions have actually gone up during this administration? How can you ignore the millions of people around the earth that have had clean water, indoor plumbing, lights, electricity provided to them, making their lives better, literally extending their lifespan, lifting them out of poverty by having access to electricity that's been provided by coal, oil, gas, or other fossil fuels? It simply can't be ignored. Their lives are better, their lives are longer as a direct result of that. So to sit there and say that we should be trying to eliminate these fuels is absolutely absurd, ridiculous. The desire by this administration to shut down our domestic energy production is causing prices to escalate, forcing Montanans to make difficult decisions about heating their homes or simply putting food on their table. And those are facts. Many people overseas are harvesting the remaining timber that exists in their country, having access to, in order to burn firewood, in order to heat their homes. This is bad for the environment and terrible for those who are forced into those situations. Unfortunately, my colleagues across the aisle have been extremely selective about when they would like to use science-based information. How about if we start using science-based information about managing the population of grizzly bears in the state of Montana, which populations are at 300% and 400% of the target populations, so that we can delist these animals? How about if we use science-based information and allow the state of Montana to continue to manage our wolf populations, which are 10 and 12-fold beyond the target populations? And how about if we allow forest management practices that would prevent millions of acres from burning each year, absolutely ruining air, land, and water quality across the state, across the nation, and start using some best management practices on how to take care of those forests, which would not only help keep our air, land, and water clean, but it would also help the economy, provide jobs, and be better for everyone who's connected with it. For all of those reasons, I will be opposing this amendment. Thank you very much.
Chairman.
I will yield the balance of my time to my friend from Wisconsin. Thank you.
I would just, if I may, pose a question to the gentle lady. When you use I think the term is impact that is in your amendment. When you say impact, does that include doing a rigorous study of the positive impacts? Is it looking at both sides, that there has been effluent, there have been emissions, and we need to account for that, but there's also been benefits. When you say impact, do you mean both sides, positives and negatives?
Thank you. And will the gentleman yield?
Mr. Chair, I would yield an answer to the representative from New York.
Yes, I'm not sure if there's confusion about the substance of the amendment, but the amendment is specifically about an assessment on the health and safety impact. If there are practices that are revealed to have positive health impacts on the communities, on impacted and frontline communities, I do not dispute the inclusion of any positive health impacts. I believe that we should have information on things that may improve people's health, but of course, there is a large degree of concerning information about the potential health impacts, breathing impacts, cancer exposure, et cetera. And this amendment is not saying stop drilling. This amendment is not speaking to that issue in this moment. This amendment specifically speaks to the collection of data of health and safety on frontline and vulnerable communities that would be nearby these sites.
May I use a balance of the time, gentlemen?
I yield back the balance of my time to Representative Tiffany.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I appreciate the answer. I will not be able to support this amendment because there was a but in there in the answer that came from the lady who offered the amendment, and it is not focusing on also the good things that could have happened as a result of, we have life expectancy in a little over a century here that went from 50 years to into the 70s. Infant mortality was 1 in 10 100 years ago. It is not anywhere near that. So I don't think this amendment captures it.
The gentleman's time has expired.
I'll yield back.
The chair recognizes Ranking Member Grijalva for 5 minutes.
Let me go back to the gentlelady's point from New York, whose amendment we're discussing. The fundamental issue, as I see it, is the issue of public health. Period. And we're talking about primarily about communities, and this committee in the previous session dealt with the issue of environmental justice and frontline communities repeatedly, and managed to pass from committee a bill to deal with some of those issues. The gentlelady's amendment reinforces the issue of public health, and I think it is a critical one. We're talking about overburdened communities. We're talking about a legacy of public health issues. And before a project that would further layer negative public health consequences on these communities, they're assessing that. And so that we do no harm. We don't increase the harm. To me, it is about not only just disclosure, but it is about adding a layer of protection that does not exist for these communities at this point. And the communities that we went to and were able to visit, whether it was in Louisiana, in Cancer Alley, whether it was in indigenous communities affected by uranium mining and the consequences of that, whether it was in Los Angeles and the issue of air pollution and the concentration of industries provoking that, to coast communities that saw the erosion of their land and the huge economic losses of value to property over and over again. Those are all impacted communities. And to assess the public health and, yes, the economic consequences of a given region, I think is a practical, pragmatic request so that we can make assessments. What we're talking about here is historic, but we're also talking about, in this amendment, about producing the evidence necessary to make the decisions that agencies must make. And if it is to do more harm and it is to overburden, then that is a decision that has to be rectified and changed. And I think that amendment speaks to that. It does not speak to drilling. It does not speak to how much energy is being generated. It talks about health impacts, and I think that is a fair and pragmatic request, and I support it entirely. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlewoman from Colorado, Ms. Boebert, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So with this amendment, I don't think any of us are opposed to actually having oversight to understand the health and safety with our fossil fuel productions. We want you to know the truth. We want you to see these reports. But as the gentleman from Wisconsin stated, there was a but in that. Not at this time. At this time, we aren't going to use that to go against fossil fuels, but we will use it later. We have been studying the science of fossil fuels. I worked in the oil and gas industry myself, and I know that no one produces energy better than we do, cleaner than we do. And instead, we have an administration right now that's begging Iran, begging Venezuela, begging Saudi Arabia, emptying our strategic petroleum reserves in the name of a midterm election. This is not in the name of public health and safety. This was in the name of an election to get fuel prices down $1 or $2 so they wouldn't have a complete decimation of their party and they would still hold on to their levers of power. And thankfully, the American people saw through some of that. But I mean, just going through this, fossil fuel extraction is a significant driver of carbon pollution. If carbon pollution is your main aim, then let's talk about managing our forests, because one catastrophic wildfire emits more carbon emissions in a few short days than every vehicle in my state of Colorado running 24/7 for an entire year. So if carbon pollution is what you're after here, then let's get together and manage our forests. We have 6 billion standing dead trees in the western United States, all creating a massive tinderbox waiting to ignite. If you want to talk about water quality, then again, let's talk about managing our forests, because healthy forests have healthy watersheds. We can have water resiliency discussions and water storage discussions where we're seeing policies in states like California where they're dumping hundreds of billions of gallons of water into the ocean where they otherwise could have stored it. If you're talking about low-income communities being impacted, well, let's talk about inflation. Let's talk about how our energy independence lowers inflation. And that's something that this administration surrendered on day one. This is something that they attacked immediately. We should be energy dominant right now. Our natural gas is 42% cleaner than Russia's. So why are you supporting Russia and their energy production and not America? Why are you pro-Putin when it comes to natural gas? Let's export liberty, export freedom around the globe, and send our clean LNG to these countries who are currently relying on dictators. And when you're talking about the indigenous communities, well, I invite you all to come to my district where one of our tribes has the first ever zero emissions net power natural gas fired plant. This is innovative. And this is what we should be doing with our other plants, our coal-fired energy plant in Craig, Colorado. I would love to see that transition into what our tribes are doing on their reservations, on their tribal land. And so come out and see what this looks like. See what this net zero energy production actually looks like. Even in Colorado, our coal is arguably the cleanest coal in the world. And climate extremists are sacrificing that at the altar of climate change. And look, I'm not here to deny climate change. I don't think anyone here is. It happens 4 times every year. We're very, very much aware of that. And what we can do to lessen pollutants, we're here for it. That's why we are pro natural gas. That's why we want to lower folks' energy bills. Have you seen the price of energy bills lately? That's because we're banning gas electronics, appliances. That's because we're pushing all of this green energy that's not efficient, it's not reliable, it's not renewable. And you know, I would love to see an actual study on our fossil fuel production, but not in this manner, because there are hidden elements in it. And for that reason, I will be opposing this amendment. And I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Magaziner from Rhode Island, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I'll yield to Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
Thank you. You know, it continues to seem as though there is confusion about the substance of the amendment itself. Several references to a but. There is not one but in the language of this one paragraph amendment. Public health impact is a neutral term. It does not specifically cite negative impact. But importantly, many of us have traveled throughout the country to varying different sites of energy production. I have visited with families who say that they will be near an extraction site, and at different times of the day, their lungs start burning. I personally represent an area of the country that has some of the highest childhood asthma rates in the world. In a parallel committee that I also serve on, the Oversight Committee, we conducted certain investigations on the exposure of people to PFAS and the inordinate amount of reproductive cancers and other cancers that have been developed due to exposures nearby airports, military sites, et cetera. People deserve to know if they're being poisoned. People deserve to know if there's no health impact. People deserve to know if they're living near a place that is helping them or hurting them. And that is the basis of this one paragraph amendment. There have been so many times in history where people have been told by companies, by governments, that what they are near is safe, and they find out later on that they were not. And whether it is mountaintop extraction, whether it is PFAS exposure, whether it is fossil fuel extraction, we should not turn a blind eye to where there may be evidence that people may be encountering a health harm, especially when it comes to public policy. So that really is the substance of this amendment. The amendment itself does not speak to drilling. It does not speak to ending it. It does not speak to any of that. It is saying people, we deserve and we should study the health impacts of this production, including water quality, the health impacts of carbon pollution, and public health. That's what this says. I don't know what language other folks are reading, but the paragraph is right here. I believe it's been provided to everybody, and I believe that people deserve to know if they are safe or if they are unsafe when exposed to certain extraction sites. And with that, I yield back to Mr. Magaziner.
Thank you. And I'll just say again, this amendment does not strike a single word from the original text. So all of the topics that members of the majority have just run through, there's nothing to stop us from looking at any of them, from looking at the serious issues that you've raised, from looking at the wacky off-the-wall issues that you may raise. There's nothing to stop this committee from engaging in all of those topics. This is purely additive. Why would we not want to expand the body of information that we provide to the public and to this committee in its policymaking? Why do we want to bury our heads in the sand and deny people information about the impacts of extractive industries? Once again, nothing here strikes or cuts the ability to look at anything else. This is just about giving the American people the facts and giving us as a committee the facts so that we can make good decisions. And I'll just echo once again what others have said. We know that low-income communities, particularly communities of color, do bear the brunt of the climate crisis. We see it in asthma rates. We see it in cancer rates. We see it in a range of climate-related health outcomes. So why would we want to hide this information from the American people? This is purely additive to the scope of the committee's work. It does not eliminate our ability to look at any other topic. And with that, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else wish to be recognized? Mr. Graves, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the intent of the gentlelady's amendment. I understand that we should all be focused on health outcomes, and I think that all of us agree. The problem is that I think the premise, and in fact the black letter of the amendment actually is inaccurate, in that it suggests that that oil and gas production disproportionately affects a certain demographic of the population. There's actually an NAACP study. In fact, we had this debate in this committee last Congress, NAACP study that indicated actually that there were a lower percentage of communities of color located in proximity to energy production. I know that my home state of Louisiana, we have about 1/3 black population in our state. And when we went through and we looked at where the production was compared to the population, it wasn't even close in regard. And so saying that another way, there were many, I guess, white and what I refer to as Cajun folks proximate to where energy production was. Secondly, I think that what we should be doing is looking really globally. And as a matter of fact, if you look over the last few years, what we've seen is that the policies that are being carried out by the Biden administration, and unfortunately by this committee in the last Congress, we've actually seen adverse impacts on communities, and that we've seen communities have energy bills go up as a result of these policies, causing literally thousands and thousands of dollars of impacts on those who can least afford it, meaning their energy bills are going up, it's costing more to refuel their cars. And just to put a finer point on it, the last time we had Secretary Haaland come testify before this committee, I asked her if she was aware of the volume of energy that we were importing from Russia, and she was unable to answer the question. And during the Biden administration in the first year, and I'm going to be wrong because I'm doing this from memory, but we had like a tripling or something, and again, give me wiggle room on that, of dependence upon Russian energy. If we all care about the global environment, which I know you do, and I do as well, we should be looking at ways to use U.S. resources in a way that actually reduces emissions. And for example, the Russian energy has about a 41% higher life cycle emissions than U.S. gas. Said another way, if we had simply taken 1 year of Russian gas that was going into the European Union and replaced it with U.S. gas, we would have had 218 tons, million tons of emissions reduction. And so, let me just circle back and close out here one more time. The gentlelady's amendment in regard to trying to protect or improve health of our communities, I'm in. I'm totally in. But I think that one, just the black letter of the amendment, I think has some things that are contrary to some data that we've had presented at this very committee. And secondly, I think that the scope is flawed and that we're looking only at the United States whenever the reality is using our resources. In fact, studies that have been done showing that OCS, Outer Continental Shelf oil and gas production, is either the lowest emissions per barrel or cubic foot of gas, or the second lowest. I believe 2 different studies. One said Saudi Arabia was the lowest, the other said ours was the lowest, if I remember correctly. And so we should be looking more holistically at how we actually improve global health outcomes, global emissions reduction, rather than looking myopically at one particular issue area that doesn't paint the true picture of global health. So I urge rejection of this amendment and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else wish to be?
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Ledger-Fernandez, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the argument of we cannot study something because other stuff is happening just misses the point that we are addressing federal lands here. And looking at the last sentence, which is the operable sentence, it says, the committee will perform oversight to understand how federal fossil fuel programs impact community health and safety, period. And so that's all that says. But I would also point out that when the chair of the Southern Ute tribe testified here, they do have an amazing, and I have visited the Southern Ute, they are a model program for a lot of what they do. But he also always pointed out that they are also pursuing renewable energy projects because they recognize that that is really important, and they are always very federal forward-looking. They're an amazing, have had amazing leadership over the years. I'd like to have the rest of my time. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, would you like to take it?
Thank you, Representative. You know, I think, again, when you look at the text here, While we see that there is historic disproportionate impact, including communities of color, it is not limited to communities of color. We also discuss low-income communities, as well as any frontline or vulnerable community, regardless of race. Historically, we have seen some of those disproportionate impacts, but as the representative noted, the active language here is, I would argue, is in the last sentence, which is that the committee will perform oversight to understand how federal fossil fuel programs impact community health and safety. There are no limitations. While there is past data indicating certain income levels of communities, certain frontline communities, this is really about assessing the health impacts on any community that would be potentially exposed to a health risk. And with that, I yield back to the gentlelady.
Gentlelady, yield back. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez. Gentlelady yields back her time. Does any other member wish to be recognized? Mr. Bentz, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to point out that I believe many of the elements that are contained in the proposed amendment are found in what is before us today, the plan. They're there. And I would hazard a wild guess that if this amendment doesn't pass, and I think it will fail, I hope it fails, we'll still hear a lot about it over the period of this committee. I'm just guessing. I've certainly heard a lot about it over the past 2 years, and we're going to hear a lot more about it as these issues are brought before our various committees. And I say that because it's obvious. When we get into the conversation, going back to the plan itself, authorization and oversight plan, page 5, conservation versus preservation. Well, of course, someone can bring up why this particular issue is of importance. Federal land acquisition, access and recreation, I mean, on and on. But I wouldn't have spoken about for just calling out the fact that we're going to hear a lot more about this. I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm just saying I don't think we need the amendment to do it. I want to call up one other thing. The second sentence of the amendment says these burdens are disproportionately concentrated in communities of color, low-income communities, and indigenous communities. Indeed, the studies indicate that that is the case. But the assertion or the prompt by this amendment would suggest that it's federal fossil fuel extraction that leads to that unfortunate outcome. And it actually, the studies, I was just going through them, suggest that really it's a result of truly, truly unfortunate housing policies in the past. Unfortunate, I think, is too simple a term, and other causes as opposed to merely federal fossil fuel extraction. With that, Mr. Chair, I'm going to yield back the rest of my time to you.
Gentleman yields back. Does anybody else wish to be recognized? And to be clear for Mr. Huffman, I'm recognizing myself for my statement on the amendment, which I do oppose. And the gentlelady almost had me with this amendment. We all care about public health. We all care about safety. I think that's our duties as members of Congress. We have some areas on this committee where we can work on that. One of them is NEPA. We have jurisdiction over NEPA, and we have, I think, an obligation to fix NEPA so that it works for the country. But I think we would be getting into the jurisdiction of other committees when we start talking about public safety and health. We're getting into the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. It's fascinating discussion. You mentioned childhood asthma. I've seen reports that talk about poverty as the #1 cause of childhood asthma because of indoor air quality. So I would, as much as I would love to discuss those issues, I don't think they're areas that we have jurisdiction over on authorization and oversight. And again, we're approving a plan for authorization and oversight, and I think we have plenty to focus on, and I oppose this amendment. And with that, is there any other discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, no. No.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to request a recorded vote.
Recorded